Hi everyone, my name's Tahj. I'm here with Jimmy and Sid. Just before we begin, we'd like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the lands in which we're presenting. I'm in Canberra and Jimmy and Sid are in Melbourne. And we'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So, as I said, my name's Tahj and I'm an architectural graduate and an urban designer.
My name's Jimmy. I'm an architectural graduate also and independent researcher in Melbourne.
I'm Sid. I'm the program coordinator, landscape architecture at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne.
And as a prelude to our talk today, this is sort of a driver. So our cities have often been transformed by decisions that sit quite starkly to how cities are actually inhabited. And I guess what we're referring to here is the quite formal top-down planning systems, which are commonplace in Melbourne and across Australia and I guess the Western world. Current methodologies of urban development in Australia are inherently top-down, and they often fail to recognise the potential of bottom-up development and how it can influence more equitable and more active urban societies. I guess another driver to having this discussion now is thinking about what happens to urban life beyond COVID-19, and there's a lot of unknowns in the way that our cities will be operating in the future. I guess a key question that we've been thinking about is the future of public space and what does it mean to be in public beyond COVID-19, but also what is the impact upon street life and small businesses across Melbourne in particular, but also across Australia. With businesses being forced to close and whole sectors urged to work from home, street life has sort of grinded to a halt in Melbourne City and across its suburbs. And I guess we're saying that these measures are actually very significant and they have the potential to uproot the way we think about our cities in the future. And they will need a response to. We can't ignore them. And different cities across the world are responding differently, and there are trends in how cities are recovering, and more close to home in Melbourne. These are some examples, and Sydney, sorry, some examples of how Melbourne and Sydney are beginning the recovery process. And with Dan Andrews recently stating an additional amount of funding for outdoor recovery being a key incentive in promoting urban life, but also enabling businesses to keep operating. And also in Sydney, the focus upon temporary urbanism as a potential way out of, as a way of sort of reactivating public spaces, but also more broadly, the fact that small businesses are struggling at the moment, and the government has announced a lot of money to sort of incentivize small business and to help small business. So these are sort of the things that have been currently been focused on, and our talk is really about we've seen that we recognize the potential that informal urbanism can bring to this discussion.
Yes, yeah. So in many ways what Daniel Andrews and other governments are proposing dovetails quite well with the notion of informal urbanism, which we are putting forward today as providing venues where we can tackle many of these issues that Tahj has raised earlier.
Yeah, I think what we're claiming here is that there's something really important to understand in the way that informal settlements and informal urbanism operates, and that we as designers can learn from this.
So to start things off, big question, what is informal urbanism? And a simple definition is informal urbanism refers to bottom-up urban spatial temporal practices that extend beyond the conceptualizations and rules of formal development agents, such as planners, designers, and developers that Tahj referred to in the beginning. And we observe that some key qualities include access to the city, identity, flexibility, temporality, adaptability, and incrementality that we'll be discussing in the ensuing slides.
And these slides, which Jimmy's taken all of the photos in this presentation, show that informality is a global phenomenon and it happens across the world. So perhaps Jimmy, actually, you should explain.
Yeah, exactly. No, for example, this photo here on the left shows a number of street vendors that have set up shop, and even a small restaurant on the edge of a busy highway in Cairo, in Egypt. And the image on the right is one taken in New York of one of New York's many infamous hot dog stands. And that, putting these side by side, you can see these are both examples of informal urbanism, but in completely different contexts, both occupying the footpath and creating a vibrancy and dynamism to a street or space that was previously nothing. I guess the next photo shows a section of a small fruit market on a street of Hong Kong, and on the right is a similar fruit market, but on the edge of a highway in Lae in Papua New Guinea. Again, two very different contexts, but both examples of how informal urbanism can kind of activate a space.
And also, which we'll touch on in the next few slides, but also how informality often acts as a way of facilitating social mobility and enabling people to sort of create better lives for themselves.
And this first photo shows here on the left a Nasi Uduk restaurant. This is taken in Bandung in 2015, and on the right is a Moose's Kebabs, a kebab shop off Nicholson Street in Brunswick East. And both of these structures are temporary in their nature, and they occupy spaces used for different purposes during the day, and at night they come out and activate these spaces. So on the left in Bandung, this is at the end of a cul-de-sac, and on the right here, this is a kebab shop in the corner of a car wash.
And I guess these slides are really trying to demonstrate that informal urbanism isn't just restricted to Southeast Asia or the global South, but it's really it exists in our cities in Australia, and it's often overlooked and misunderstood and sort of recedes into the background.
And fundamental to all these practices, we argue that access to the city, or the right to the city here, for minorities and marginalized groups and individuals to appropriate the city is quite key. And to quote David Harvey here, the right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is, I want to argue, one of the most precious yet most neglected of our human rights. End of quote. And so this implies that identity is key here, relating to that access. So fringe groups are able to identify with and even co-define the city and thus take ownership of the city. And we see that tactics to achieve informal urbanism includes, as mentioned, flexibility and adaptability in uses, functions, and activities in space, temporality and incrementality in time, and in effect, these two become patterns embedded in cultural practice in time and space.
And as I sort of raised earlier, as an extension of the right to the city, or the right to access the city, is the right to make a better life for yourself. And informality often is a process by which people can improve their social outcomes. And this is a photo from Bandung where it's a semi-formal settlement where we can see an aspiring middle-class suburb sort of springing up from an informal settlement. And again, another example in Melbourne is the phenomenon of kebab vans, and as an example of small businesses sort of creating a business that begins small and that is fairly cheap to operate and sort of occupies the cracks of our cities, which often lead to more formal establishments and social mobility. So just for our talk today, the next few slides sort of break down a few observations and lessons based on our previous research and analysis, which draw directly from these three projects that we've done together. So the first project is called Kampung Value, which is a collection of analysis and research from a travelling studio conducted between the Melbourne School of Design and the Institute of Technology in Bandung.
Yep. And those were studios led by Amanda Ahmadi and myself back in 2014, 2015, and also last year in 2019. And Tahj and Jimmy were part of the group that went in 2014. And it's through those exposure to urban informality in Indonesia and Bandung that has laid the interest for the two ensuing projects. So we start observing informality in a first world city like Melbourne itself, and see those as phenomenons in Footscray and the notion of kebab urbanism, which Jimmy can expand on a bit.
Then the next project, Patterns of Footscray, was a thesis project that Tahj and I conducted at the Melbourne School of Design back in 2016. And it's really an ongoing research project looking into the suburb and the pressures on the suburb in terms of gentrification and really recording the different kinds of urbanism in that particular suburb of Melbourne.
And then the last project is really a photographic collection of images that Jimmy's taken, but also some analysis about the phenomenon of kebab vans in Melbourne and why, sort of understanding firstly why there are so many, but also understanding how they operate and how they're such alternative forms of urbanism to the mainstream.
And critically in Melbourne and Australia, we observe urban informality as manifest quite well and dovetails quite strongly with the notion of multiculturalism, which we see as a phenomenon of a bottom-up process of how migrants access the city. And it's through these three projects that we derived some lessons, and we have five. We're proposing 5 lessons here. Those are by all means not exhaustive. There's many more, but due to the limitations of time, we are picking these 5. The first one being social capital, and we define social capital is individual and collective wealth benefits contained in personal relationships and connections. And trust is one key currency of social capital, and we'll be discussing that in the ensuing slides.
So yeah, I guess informal settlements boast high levels of social interaction. The overlapping land uses, the intensity of the street life, the population density, and the morphology of them, they manifest higher levels of social connectivity. And in fact, the informal sector has emerged as a complex system of social interactions.
And this photo is not in a informal settlement in Southeast Asia, but rather is a picture of a foot walk in Footscray in Melbourne, and really provides a snapshot of the vibrancy of street life in that suburb. And as a backdrop, we can see the Footscray market, and we'll touch on the market in a bit.
So I guess also for those who don't know where Footscray is, it's a suburb in Melbourne, approximately 5 kilometres west of the city. And just a bit about it, it's currently a major point of confluence for some of Melbourne's largest multicultural communities, the urban environment of Footscray has been able to successfully adapt over time in order to accommodate for the needs of this constantly developing city. And Footscray itself has been able to achieve this by enacting an alternative model of urban development to the mainstream, whereby these different waves of immigrant communities have been able to alter and adapt the urban environment to suit their own particular practices and identities. And it's created we'll touch on it later, but it's created a really interesting urban fabric that is wholly unique.
And I guess most prevalent in Footscray is the street life and the active street life, and the street being a place where communities interact and where friends interact. And it's grounded by the market. So this market, which sits in the background, is the cultural anchor.
The next slide returns us to Indonesia. This is right in the city center of Jakarta. And we're seeing a shop that it has been, left on itself. There's no one guarding or manning the goods, and this happens to be during the midday prayer time. And the level of trust is so high that there's no one has to be there, because they know that no one is going to steal from them. And trust is quite a fundamental currency. And I'll give another example that is related to COVID-19. In the case of Thailand's success in addressing the pandemic, which is essentially built on that informal network of community health volunteers. There's 1 million of them scattered around every community in Thailand, including the migrant workers community. And that health worker is often the person with high social capital. So people trust them. They're often female, and they know everyone. So it makes it very easy to contact trace anyone who comes in or leaves the community. And there's little resistance as well, due to the respect that people have for them.
Another key theme that we've picked up on, that as a key manifestation of a high level of social capital, is the prevalence of community-based infrastructure in informal settlements. So again, here's a photo from Bandung. So in the background is one of the many self-built mosques in the kampong, which are not just mosques, but also places for meeting friends, for social interaction, and really community centres. So where key announcements are made, where voting happens. And these aren't just sort of standalone centres that are isolated. There are many examples of these, and they range in typology and scale.
Yep. There might just be one like hole-in-the-wall room, and they're extremely multifunctional, and that caters to a wide range of users, including informal classes that can be held there.
Yeah. I think also the fact that you mentioned it, Tahj, but the fact that they're all usually self-built and self-funded by members of the community, really, and then that they're created through this bottom-up process, really adds value to them, and means that the community really respect them and use it and value it. Something that's just dropped in.
in effect, they're the manifestation of that accretion of social capital and social wealth. So it manifests materially in these forms.
Mm-hmm. And also important to note, which sort of leads on to back to Footscray Market, is often these this type of community infrastructure is often overlooked, and especially coming back to Melbourne, Footscray Market is a key example of a community infrastructure that is the beating heart of the suburb. But we've seen so many plans for its development and sort of underappreciation of its importance to the vibrancy of the suburb. So I guess from the outside, these pieces of social infrastructure are invisible to the formal city.
And now we move on to lesson 2, human scale. And we define human scale are physical forms and spaces, spatial practices that effectively and efficiently facilitate and enrich social capital.
And I guess this is back in Bandung in Indonesia. So I guess in the first instance, it's an example of an amazing piece of micro-urbanism. So this is a small restaurant essentially. So you can see noodle storage on the left, sink or a basin, a space for spices or sauces, a cold room, a broth pot, cooking a kitchen essentially, and all transportable by one person. So firstly, just I guess we've included this to show the potential of microurbanism, the importance of or the link between microurbanism and the human scale and facilitating social mobility as well, because this represents someone's livelihood and is representative of the creativity and the ingenuity that come so rampant in informal settlements.
And critically, in relation to the previous slide, it puts people in the streets, in the public, and in always indirect contact with each other. So there's always a face that is attached to the business, whether it's moving around the kampung's network, or it's here in a more fixed form, whether in Melbourne or in Bandung. There's a human face that is attached to the business.
And so often we hear the narrative of needing to activate street life or activate the streets, and we think these examples are perfect ways of activating street life. But unfortunately, the image on the left is one of the many kiosks that throughout Melbourne's CBD that have been threatened for demolition because of their apparent damage to pedestrian flows. So again, an example of formal planning systems not valuing these types of things.
Yeah, and these lessons are well known, and since Jane Jacobs talked about eyes on the street, so this is what it's fundamentally about. But it's much more than that. It's beyond security now. It's social interaction. It's building relationships. Yeah, and social mobility, as discussed. Yeah.
And I guess also in informal settlements as the often pleasing scale and proportion of architecture and landscape, because of the human scale and the sort of intimate scale of these settlements means that people often build their houses themselves. So scale always relates to the human body.
Yep, and the notion of building the house or the mosque themselves is quite fundamental here in relation to social capital, and it ties to the local concept of gotong royong that Jimmy will expand on a bit.
Yeah, I guess gotong royong is a Bahasa term for kind of reciprocity. And it kind of refers to the traditional activities in the village where people voluntarily help each other for various occasions like festivals or sport, but also perhaps building mosques and community centres.
And we've touched on the idea of eyes on the street and facilitating a better street life by creating spaces to sit and engage on the street, which is a common lesson in Western planning as well. But also prevalent in the Indonesian kampung is micro landscapes. And although there are problems with the broader ecological context in which they sit in, there's so many examples of urban farming and sort of self-initiated landscapes, which again, I think is really relevant to how communities and suburbs might come out of COVID-19.
And this is also a manifestation of that social capital and social mobility. And this relates to a landscape concept, the Nosso's queue of care. So it reflects that, you know, they feel a strong connection with the place now, and it's an important part of the identity, and they continue to improve their own environments through these micro designs and, you know, micro landscapes and small improvements to their own houses. Lesson 3 is about mixed-use development. And for us, mixed-use developments that is negotiated through social capital and human scale encourage bottom-up initiatives, ownership, and identity of place that we discuss in the following slides.
So I guess also the effects of COVID and the forced lockdowns that are upon us have highlighted the importance of the suburb. Working from home has meant the suburbs have played an increased role in our everyday lives. If you're lucky enough to live in a well-serviced suburb, you may have had access to a supermarket, your cafe, a school, a place of worship, a place to exercise. But I think many others have found themselves not so fortunate and may have to travel outside their 5K radius to access services and the essentials. And in Indonesia, in particular, kampungs demonstrate highly mixed-use urban environments. They have their own highly complex and diverse, localized economies, like we spoke about before, and we can learn from these as designers and architects. Your street that you live on, that's just rows of single-use housing, could have a multiplicity of uses. This photo here is taken in Footscray, and it's showing us that this is also happening. This can happen in Melbourne. This is a pretty typical Victorian terrace house that is capitalising on the pedestrian flows from the suburb into the centre and converting the front of the house into an acupuncture clinic.
And likely that it operates as a shop house, which is also very relevant and rampant in the kampung, where people's businesses are tied to their places of work, which again, like Jimmy pointed out, is becoming more and more relevant as we work more from home, and the need to sort of adapt to your personal space, or to have the flexibility to adapt it into a place of work is becoming more and more relevant. And this has been done and has been done in Footscray, but also in informal settlements for a long time.
Yep. So in Footscray's case previously, it's the first room of that townhouse. In Bandung, it's the first maybe 70 centimeters.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And again, touching on the relationship between multicultural urbanism and informal urbanism, again relevant in this building that we observed in our mapping. which to the passerby sort of might blend quite easily or recede into the background and might not be very noticeable, but upon further analysis becomes clear that three different cultures are sort of inhabiting the same shell. So previously the building is called Hellenic, so might have been of a Greek origin, or a Greek building owner might have built it. But then the top floor is rented by the ethnic Chinese Happy, I can't read it, but
Happy
a Chinese
Association.
Age Association of Victoria. So a Chinese cultural community center occupies the first floor. And then on the ground floor is a Vietnamese shop that sort of straddles the street. And so within this shell, which from a plan or from a zoning perspective is a single-use building, is actually quite a complicated hybrid of mixed uses, which I think that approach is also becoming very relevant in the way we plan our cities, and it has existed in Footscray for a long time.
Yeah, and see, what we're seeing here is not isolated ethnic enclaves. This suggests evidences that cultures actually reach across each other through these practices. We come to lesson 4, temporary activations, which we define as the notion of mixed-use developments discussed earlier, extended in time, leading to more efficient use and activations of urban forms and spaces.
And in Melbourne, touching on the kebab urbanism project, this is just a very quick snapshot, or sort of to demonstrate the idea that it is a phenomenon across Melbourne. It's not just a one-off incident, but there is this phenomenon of kebab vans which occupy often overlooked or unused spaces in our cities, and they do recede in the background, but they operate across Melbourne suburbs. So they are a network, and as we mentioned before, they often sit within car washes or urban spaces that potentially have a hybrid function as well. So car washes or restaurants that operate, takeaway restaurants which operate during the day, sort of convert into these nighttime social hangouts, basically. So there's often spaces for social interaction in front of where you order, and they do activate spaces which are in a weird phase of urban transition. So they also sit in sites that are going to be developed into apartments, and they sort of sit in between the timeline of them being either sold to a developer or being developed.
I think also what's important is that they're making these underutilized and often uninhabitable spaces so much better. Usually they're on the side of highways, or like as Tahj said, in car washes that are just at night expanses of concrete and nothing else. And so, yeah, when a kebab van is open, it becomes cafes of the night.
And again, it puts the human face, a space and time that normally is without life. And hence in activating that space, it makes the space feel safer. With that presence alone, it totally transforms the atmosphere and feel of that particular spaces.
Yeah, exactly. And they often are in spaces where it's quite vehicle dominated. So they are spaces that are not pedestrian focused, and they add a level of safety and a focus upon the pedestrian and the human scale in spaces which often don't do that. So they are ways of humanizing our cities.
I guess also for many migrants, the kebab van itself is the point of entry into a new society, and they provide a path of transition into starting a more formal business, allowing owners to establish customer base and earn the money before they commit to a formal shop, maybe. And this is akin to informal settlements in Indonesia and in the kampungs. and relates back to the idea of social mobility and human scale as well.
And I think also just very relevant in how we approach our urban spaces coming out of COVID. And there's many lessons we can learn about how to sort of adapt spaces which we didn't really consider to be potential public spaces or potential social spaces, can all of a sudden quite quickly transform into something that's valued. And then in Footscray, there's many sort of examples of temporary urbanism, I guess, and that ranges in scale. So this is a weekly market that happens on the footpath in Footscray, and is completely temporary. So 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, it is very much a footpath and a street. But on Saturday morning, it completely transforms into a vibrant marketplace, and it only exists for a few hours. And again, the council that is responsible for this street has had problems with this marketplace, and is sort of sneakily trying to eliminate it from happening. So again, an example of undervaluing this type of urbanity.
Yeah, and note the scale of the business is comparable to the bakso or mobile noodle store that we showed earlier. So it's very extremely compact and temporal. So it begs the question, what is really the issue here? So they come, they occupy space for only a while, and then they move on.
And that idea of temporality is also so relevant also apparent in the Indonesian kampung. So a single space has multiple functions throughout the daytime. So at 11 a.m. on Saturday morning in this spot in Kampung Cikapundung, there's a transportable restaurant appears, and people know that it appears, and there's customers that come. Then all of a sudden it disappears and the space is empty again with no one around it. Then 8 p.m. Saturday night, all of a sudden a restaurant pops up which activates the same space. So the potential of tactical or temporary urbanism in activating spaces throughout different times of the day for different functions for different people, I think is really relevant. Thinking about how we come out of COVID.
This is taken where one of the side streets in Jakarta meets the main street, and it's very much a node and activated by these businesses from the late afternoon till quite late at night. And you can see those layers and layers of businesses and stalls, and also opportunities for young students to operate as buskers and earn some extra money that can help pay their rent. So it's fascinating. It's you great food and also great entertainment. What more can you ask for? This is at Bandung, and what we see in the background is an example of what the government has been trying to do, which is essentially try to formalize the informal. So trying to reorganize what they see as the messiness of the informal, and try to move them 5 or 6 meters above on what is comparable to the high line of Bandung. But you can't separate vendors from the street, because that's the commercial space. That's where they do business. That's where the customers are. So that hasn't really solved the problem, and we can see that vendors are still very much using the streets as this man is here, and they're also appropriating the pre-existing prop. In this case, the very large trees that is put down by the Dutch over 100 years ago, and so they're using that as part of their stalls. And we come to the final lesson that we offer to you. And so layered together spatio-temporally, all these form this fifth lesson, so multifunctional infrastructure that encourages multi-scala appropriations, interpretations of infrastructure.
So again, in Bandung, what we see here is how infrastructure is often appropriated to become more than one thing. So instead of it just being a highway, which is often the case in Melbourne and across our cities, where large-scale infrastructure projects don't facilitate social interaction or create public space. In Bandung, the nature of informal urbanism means that they are often appropriated and are established as public spaces. And although the level crossing removal projects in Melbourne have sort of shifted the view in how we sort of approach infrastructure projects, we think that beyond COVID, especially the way in which we approach infrastructure, no matter the scale, can be informed by a lot of the lessons from informal urbanism.
So that's not just highways and bridges, that's also streets and footpaths and bus shelters. For example, here we touched on this before, but this is that street in Footscray on a Saturday. And here the footpath really is a piece of social infrastructure here. All that planting is actually there to be sold. It's not there, put there by council. And again here, the same street that we spoke about previously.
And again, evidence of the importance of the footpath as more than a place for getting from A to B, but also as a place, as a public space, but also a place for people to sell things and to activate the street
and access to the city.
Yes, and again, that sort of multi-scalar approach to infrastructure is relevant in Footscray again. So what is a bus shelter that be, in many other suburbs just be a bus shelter is appropriated into an extension of a shop. So by sort of using the back of the bus shelter as a prop for a marketplace, it sort of extends the shop beyond its formal boundaries of its tenancy, but also spills out onto the footpath and does activate the street and capitalizes on pedestrian movement. So in conclusion, I guess these were just a few lessons, and there's so many more that we think are so relevant to how we approach cities in Australia. But we really do think informal urbanism offers an alternative lens to how we approach our cities, namely its importance in sort of strengthening the role of citizens in the development of cities and ensuring that not just the few have access to the city, but everyone does.
Yeah, and I would argue that, as a discipline, landscape architecture has already been trying, or very well equipped to redress these issues that we've raised, because we already claim that we advocate for ecological and social diversity and vibrancy, which in essence, is very well aligned with the practices of informal urbanism. Yeah, because nature itself cannot be introduced top down. It's really also a very much a bottom up phenomenon, and so is the notion of social vibrancy, and also addressing that notion of COVID-19 phenomenon, and also issues raised in the famous documentary in Netflix, Social Dilemma. Hope that you guys watch it. So informal urbanism also offers practices that help return value and meaning to our open space, be they private or public. And returning to the first issues that Tahj has raised, modern planning practices often increases spaces between people. So informal urbanism offers the opportunity to return those spaces to people, providing access and benefits to broader society through linking us together.
Well said. Thanks very much for watching.